As we're getting ready to begin and give people a couple of minutes, um, again, we're really appreciative that you're here. Just and know that you're joining so many people committed to this purpose. And uh, we have an amazing draw tonight with Emily Hanford speaking and sharing her work with us. And just so you have a sense, I think it's always important now more than ever. We live here in the hometown of Martin Luther King, and my favorite quote from him is that we're all tied together by a single garment of destiny. And that certainly feels like the case tonight, where we have over 3,000 people registered for this lecture, and from all 50 states and a number of other countries to participate, all on behalf of all our children. So welcome. So I think we're really ready to start. Good evening. And it was a year ago exactly that we gathered together for the Montag Lecture to hear Dr. Mary Ann Wolf. And it was right in the first moments of the COVID pandemic, and we were scrambling whether we should go forward. And we ended up and switched to a virtual format, which we had never tried before. And now, 365 days later, it's been a sobering time. We've lost lives, and there's been so much suffering that we've all experienced. As we've, again, back to Dr. King, we've all been lessened by the losses. And people talk about light at the end of the tunnel now. Well, it's important tonight to be talking about light relative to our children. And we know particularly it has been a dark time with schools shuttered and children sent home to try to learn in their homes. And we know with different degrees of internet access and resources, that there has been even greater widening disparity. I don't know if y'all seen the study from Yale that speaks so powerfully to what we've done in the last year to exacerbate the centuries-old inequity in educational opportunity. But we're grateful to be back again with you tonight. I'm Comer Yates, and I'm the executive director of the Atlanta Speech School. It's been my incredible, crazy luck to be the director here for the past 23 years. And during that entire time, we have been extraordinarily fortunate, more fortunate for their work than my being here. The Montag family has made this lecture possible, longtime supporters and leaders of our school to make this lecture possible. Well, Mary Ann's call to action last year. Now, where do we find ourselves tonight? We find ourselves where Mary Ann's call to action around a hinge moment. Are our children going to become deep readers? All our children has been accelerated by the twin pandemics of COVID and centuries of racial inequity. And let's speak to our own city here and be accountable. Here in Atlanta, Georgia, the statistics are unconscionable. 76% of our white children are proficient readers, compared to 23% of our Hispanic children, and 16% of our Black children not eligible for free and reduced lunch. For children eligible for free and reduced lunch, only 15% of those children have we given them access to literacy, compared to 70% of our children who by accident of birth have had access to educational and economic opportunity in their lives. And I should note that so much of what Emily's going to talk about tonight, that the finish line is not proficiency. I'd encourage you to read a powerful book by Dr. Goldie Muhammad from Georgia State University called Cultivating Genius, where she said proficiency is such a low bar. As Mary Ann Wolf talks about with deep reading doesn't end at comprehension. Deep reading is passing over a text and being able to decode and comprehend, but most importantly, it's to hold on to that passage, to think about what that passage means for who I am, what I believe, and what I stand for, and who I'll stand with. And Dr. Muhammad talks about that reading is for the purpose of creating identity and self-liberation and the power to liberate others. And so we're going to talk about, and with Emily tonight, we're going to talk about what that means for our children. We've been doing this work at the Speech School for 83 years. During that time, we opened as a free school back in 1938. We've never turned away a child because of financial limitation during that time. And our focus has been on children who neurobiologically are going to struggle mightily to read because they're dyslexic or they're deaf or they have speech or language delays. And our work, guided by the scientists, our partners, has been to beat the odds for those children. Today, we operate as the educational equivalent of a teaching hospital. Beyond our school, we're focused on trying to change the odds, joining so many others to change the odds for children who neurobiologically should thrive and should be proficient readers and deep readers and more, but because of denied access to educational opportunity and denied access to the science, they're going to struggle for a lifetime. And so we have our free online Cox Campus and our Rollins Center that does this work. And so we hope you'll look more at our work there. And while you'll hear tonight about explicit instruction that's needed for deep reading brain construction from kindergarten through third grade, we know that deep reading brain construction starts in the birthing hospital in the last trimester of pregnancy. So you get a sense of our work. Again, that's all free. We work at our large public birthing hospital in Atlanta, Grady Hospital, downtown, where Grady, through our partnership in Talk with a Baby, has redefined their standard of care and a healthy delivery to mean a baby who leaves the birthing hospital with a family who can provide them with the necessary language nutrition for early healthy brain development. They're going to make sure that a Hispanic family leaving that hospital, that the mom knows and doesn't fear that makes her speak English to their child because of inference or direction for their child to assimilate, but know that their child's path to self-determination means that parent must have the agency to speak in their home language for their child to be on the path to reading proficiently and beyond in English and bilingually. So that's part of our work. And where we come out is that we know the science that tells us exactly what to do to end our country, our city's illiteracy crisis. I was trying to think about that today because our staff are going to be vaccinated tomorrow and for COVID. And I was trying to think about what if we had the vaccine for COVID had been available 20 years ago. And over the course of 20 years, or any child, let's say a childhood disease, and over a course of 20 years, a vaccine that was known for that entire time, year after year, kept being distributed to a fractional number of children. And again, all about their zip code, race, and ethnicity. We wouldn't stand for that for one more minute. And the point is, relative to what we are doing to shorten our children's lives, the life-threatening influence of illiteracy, we have the science. Our society, our country knows exactly what to do. By example, we're thrilled to announce tonight that through the generosity of an anonymous donor, we are in partnership and collaboration with Dr. Deb Glazer, the author of a Reading Teacher's Top 10 Tools, where over the course of the coming months, we're creating a comprehensive reading course for pre-service and in-service teachers and school leaders to meet the moment of this inflection point after 2 years of disrupted learning and centuries of educational inequity. So Emily's going to talk tonight, Ms. Hanford is going to talk tonight, and John King, a former Secretary of Education for the United States, said that Emily's message is a must-listen one. Emily has appeared and written in countless media outlets. She's been recognized over and over again for her relentless, tireless raising of this issue of the injustice of our crisis, when we know the science tells us exactly what to do. In fact, her work on hard words in 2018 was identified as one of the top 10 pieces in defining the past decade in education. So we're here tonight to think about who we are and who we'll be for and with our children in the coming decade, where we can decide by our actions what the story will be for our children. After Emily speaks, then the director of our Rollins Center and Cox Campus, Dr. Ryan Lee James, will come on and be with Emily while they take questions, and then Ryan will speak more about our work, all of our work, which is free. And again, we hope you'll, just a shameless plug for something that's free, please join the 154,000 members in all, again, in all 50 states and 62 countries who are joining together to end this illiteracy crisis and follow the science. So as we think about this hinge moment, this inflection point, as our children return to school and prepare to meet them on the first day of school in 21-22 school year, I want to welcome Emily Hanford and tell her how appreciative we are that she's with us here tonight. And Emily, thank you so much for being with us. We couldn't be more grateful. Welcome to the speech school. We're sorry you're not here in person, but your message resonates here every day. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Comer, very much. Thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to share some slides here. Share my screen. Here we go. Okay. All right, let's see. I think you can see that. I'm going to play. Okay, there you go. All right, well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for that nice introduction, Comer. Or whatever time of day it is for you, because I understand there are people from all over the country, maybe all over the world. It would have been really nice if this event were in person, but then a lot of you might not be here. So thank you again for having me and for coming. Here's what I'm going to do with our time together this evening. I'm going to tell you the story of how I became interested in how children learn to read. And I'm going to tell you some of what I've learned along the way about the science of reading and about how children are being taught to read in many schools right now in this country. Now, to be very clear up front, I'm not a reading teacher, I'm not a reading researcher, and I'm not the parent of a struggling reader. I'm a reporter, and I've been covering education now for 13 years. And in that time, I have spent many hours in classrooms, and I have interviewed hundreds of teachers. And one of the things I've learned is that teaching is hard, really hard, especially right now. So to all of the teachers and other educators who are in the audience, thank you for what you're doing to educate children in these especially difficult times. Teaching is not only challenging in the best of times, teaching may also be the most controversial profession in America. That's how Dana Goldstein put it in her fabulous book, The Teacher Wars. Dana Goldstein is now an education reporter for the New York Times. So why is teaching a controversial profession? I think it's in large part because teaching is such an important job. Teachers are really on the front lines when it comes to many of the issues that are most pressing in this country right now. To me, those are opportunity and how it's distributed, equity and how it's achieved, and success and how it's accomplished. What teachers do every day in their classrooms is critical. And I am not here today to criticize teachers or other educators. I am here to raise questions and to raise awareness about something that is shocking to me as a reporter, as a parent, and as a citizen. And the shocking thing is basically this. Over the past 50 years, cognitive scientists and neuroscientists and psychologists and linguists and other researchers all over the world have conducted a whole bunch of studies, thousands of them, in labs and in classrooms to try to understand how people learn to read. But this mountain of scientific evidence about reading is not making its way into many classrooms. Teachers and other educators are not, for the most part, being taught this science in their teacher preparation programs. They are not taught this science in professional development they get on the job. In fact, some of what they learn about reading and how to teach it is actually at odds with what the scientific evidence says. Now, I did not know any of this, zero, a few years ago. So I'm going to go to the next slide here. So I've actually been a reporter for 25 years, and education is what I've been doing most recently. So I've been covering education full-time since 2008. And in my time as an education reporter, I have been particularly interested in two different things: how family income generally and how poverty in particular affect educational opportunities and outcomes. And I've also been really interested in how people learn, the findings from cognitive science and how those play out or not in classrooms. So almost all the reporting that I did was focused on secondary and post-secondary education. That photo of me in the classroom with the little kids was the very first reporting project that I did for American Public Media. It was about preschool. And then I really didn't do very much on early education at all until I got interested in reading a few years ago. And that is when I realized that reading instruction is truly where it is at if you are interested in educational equity, opportunity, and how people learn. So this is the first reporting project I did about reading back in 2017. It was a long time ago. I had no idea that I would be on the same topic still today. So Hard to Read is a podcast episode and also an article that you can read online. And it's about why students with dyslexia have such a hard time getting what they need in school. I knew really nothing about dyslexia, but I was hearing the same story, like the exact same story, from parents all over the country. And here's how the story goes. I think some of you are probably familiar with it. The story goes like this. Our child started school and we knew something wasn't right. We went to the kindergarten teacher and she said, "Don't worry, make sure you read lots of books to him. Everything will be fine." But reading just seemed like it was really hard for him. He didn't seem to get it. We went to the first grade teacher and she said, "Don't worry, all kids learn differently. He will catch up." But he really didn't seem to be making much progress. By second grade, he was avoiding reading. He was telling us he didn't want to go to school. The teacher said, "We just haven't found him the right book yet. It'll all come together in time." And it went on and on like this. The parents saying, "Something's not right here." The school saying, "Everything's fine." And the parents, they don't really know what to do because the schools are the education experts, right? Now, at some point, the parents may start thinking, could our child have dyslexia? But when they bring dyslexia up with the school says, no, we don't say that here. We don't use the word dyslexia. So maybe their child gets pulled out of the classroom for some extra help. Maybe he gets some accommodations like extra time on tests and audiobooks. But the boy still does not learn how to read because he's not taught how to do it. Because this is what I've learned in my reporting. The school does not actually know that much about how reading works, which means the school doesn't really know what's going on when a child is struggling to read. And at the end of the day, they don't really know quite what to do about it. I took a class on the science of reading. Most of my classmates were teachers, and here's what some of them said about their preparation to teach reading. One teacher: "I didn't feel adequately prepared to teach reading. This is hard for me to admit because I have several degrees and felt like I should know what I was doing." Another teacher: "I kept falsely reassuring myself my students weren't making growth because of this reason or that reason, although deep down I feared it was me and my instruction. I wasn't adequately prepared. It's not that I didn't care, it's that I didn't know any better." And then this teacher: "I felt so angry and guilty when I was finally taught the basics of reading science. I thought, how did you let me teach literacy without knowing this?" So I'm going to explain some of the basics of the science of reading in just a minute, but first I want to finish the story of the worried parents with the struggling reader. Here is what happens if the family has time and money, especially money. They take things into their own hands. They pay for private testing. That can cost thousands of dollars. They might pay for private tutoring, more thousands of dollars. Maybe they hire an educational consultant or an attorney, or maybe both, to help them fight for what their child needs in public school. All of this is not just expensive, it's exhausting, frustrating, and it's really, really, really hard. And the parents begin to realize that their child may never get what he needs in public school, or at least he's not going to get it fast enough, because now he's 8 or 9 or 10 years old and he's starting to hate school. And he's falling behind in other subjects because he can't read well enough. Maybe he's beginning to act out in school. Maybe it's manifesting as depression and anxiety and withdrawal. And maybe their child, 8 or 9 or 10 years old, has actually said to them, "I want to kill myself." I have heard this from an alarming number of parents. Little kids who say they want to die because they can't read. This is when, if they have the resources, the parent pulls their child out of public school. Maybe they homeschool them. Maybe the family figures out a way to come up with the tens of thousands of dollars that it can cost to send their child to a specialized private school, if there's a good private school nearby, and that is a big if. At one point, I was with a group of moms in a dyslexia advocacy group, and I realized that none of them had their struggling readers in public school anymore. They had all given up on the idea that public schools could help their kids learn how to read. But they were still doing advocacy, fighting for other people's children. Here is the situation that we are in this country. If you can come up with the money to pay for it, you can probably find a way for your struggling reader to be taught how to read. But if you don't have the money and your child is not learning to read in school, what do you do? The equity implications of this are stunning. If you're from a low or even a moderate income family, there is no safety net. There's no backup if you're not being taught to read in school. One mom said to me, "Getting help for a struggling reader is a rich man's game." Reading, the most basic, most fundamental skill, the foundation upon which all academic learning is built, that is a rich man's game. So how did this happen? How is it allowed to continue? This led me to the next reporting project, which Comer mentioned. It's called Hard Words. So this is also a podcast episode and an article that you can read online. I encourage people to listen to the podcast episodes. They're not the articles read out loud. This was in 2018, and it's about core reading instruction. So not what needs to be done for struggling readers in particular, but rather, what do all children need to learn to become good readers? The bottom line from decades of scientific research is basically this: what kids with dyslexia need to learn to become good readers is not substantially different from what all people need to learn to become good readers. Kids with dyslexia will need a more intense dose of a certain kind of instruction, but all kids benefit from the kind of instruction that children with dyslexia desperately need. Now, Hard Words focused quite a bit on phonics instruction. And it focused on phonics instruction for two big reasons. One, phonics has been the focus of so much debate and controversy for years, literally decades. When people are fighting about reading, they are usually fighting about phonics. It's like the lighter fluid in the wars about reading. The other reason I focused on phonics is because what scientists have discovered is that phonics skills are critical when it comes to becoming a good reader. Why is that? Because the starting point for reading is sound. What a child has to figure out to become a skilled reader is that the words that she hears and knows how to say are made up of speech sounds. Those are called phonemes. And she has to understand that in an alphabetic language like English, phonemes are represented by various letters and combinations of letters. Now, this is something human beings have to be taught. Reading skill does not develop naturally in response to being read to. Learning to read is not like learning to speak. If you immerse a child in an environment of spoken language, unless she has a hearing problem or a severe developmental issue, she will learn to speak her native language. Not so with reading. Immersing children in a literate environment is not enough because we are not born with brains that are wired to read. That's because human beings invented written language really recently, just a few thousand years ago. Children need to be taught how their written language works. Now, some children need very little instruction, but some children need a lot. So this is a slide that some of you may have seen. It's by a woman named Nancy Young in Canada, and she has compiled estimates from a number of studies, and you can go online and find footnotes that tell you where all this information comes from. And what this graphic shows is that about 40% of kids are going to learn to read no matter how you teach them. A little bit of instruction and immersion in a literate environment is probably going to do the job. But most children, more than half, are not going to learn to read well unless they are explicitly taught how their written language works. And some kids are going to need a whole lot of explicit instruction. A key thing for educators and policymakers to understand is that all kids benefit from being taught how their written language works. Even those kids who may not need it can become better readers and especially better spellers if they are taught how their written language works. I'll come back to that phrase in a minute. So no one, absolutely no one, is arguing that phonics instruction is all children need to become good readers. It is not. There is much more to teaching a child how to read than teaching phonics. So to understand how kids learn to read, a good place to begin is with something called the simple view of reading. The simple view of reading does not say that reading is simple. It says that reading can be divided into two parts. The simple view was first proposed a long time ago. I was still in high school. It was 1986, and it was a couple of researchers. Their names are Philip Goff and William Tunmer. They proposed this model back in 1986 because they were trying to clarify the role of decoding in reading comprehension. Everyone agrees that the goal of reading is to comprehend text. The question is, how does a little kid get there? The simple view says that reading comprehension is the product of two things. So one is your ability to decode words. You see the letter string READING, and you know that that string of letters represents the word reading. The other part of the equation is your language comprehension. So that's your ability to understand spoken language. We're not talking about your ability to read text. Language comprehension is your ability to understand meaning when someone is talking or when text is being read out loud to you. So for example, when someone says, she is reading the book, you know what that verb means in the sentence, you know what she's doing. The simple view says that if you have really good language comprehension skills, but zero decoding skills, your reading comprehension will be zero, because 0 times anything is 0. The simple view also says that if you have really good decoding skills, but very poor language comprehension skills, you just don't know the meaning of that many words in spoken language, your reading comprehension is not going to be very good either. So let's look at how this applies to learning how to read. Most kids entering school have very little when it comes to the decoding part of the equation. They have 0 or close to 0 when it comes to the D in the simple view of reading equation. But they do have something when it comes to the language comprehension part of the equation. In other words, when children enter school, they know the meaning of lots of words, but they don't know how to decode those words yet. This is why people familiar with the science of reading call for an emphasis on phonics instruction in the early grades. Because if the goal is to get to reading comprehension, and you have a bunch of 5- and 6-year-olds before you who have language comprehension skills, but virtually no decoding skills, what do you need to do to help those children get to reading comprehension? You need to help those children develop decoding skills. What you want to focus on with little kids is getting their decoding skills up to their level of language comprehension. Now, the simple view clearly shows that focusing only on decoding would be a very big mistake because it's only half the equation. And as everyone knows, kids come into school with very different language comprehension skills. Some kids know the meaning of lots and lots and lots of words, and some kids have far smaller vocabularies. So reading instruction that aligns with the simple view has to focus on the language comprehension part of the equation too. This means lessons and activities that expand children's oral vocabularies. I was in a first grade classroom in Oakland, California, where reading instruction was deliberately aligned with the simple view of reading. And here's what I saw. explicit phonics instruction in one part of the reading instruction. And the kids were broken into small groups depending on the level of their decoding skills, because kids are at very different levels. Another part of the reading instruction was explicit vocabulary lessons and lots of reading out loud by the teacher. And the words that the kids had learned were posted on cards, and they were all over the classroom. And this was like early spring, and these cards were covering the windows at this point. And they included words like neighborly, extraordinary, gigantic, and ridiculous. So those are not words that the vast majority of first graders are going to be able to decode, and they shouldn't be expected to. But the first graders in this class were learning the pronunciation and meaning of these words so that when they're able to read them, they'll know what the words mean. By the way, every child in this class in California spoke a language other than English at home. And for some of the kids, English was their third language. Now, the simple view was proposed as a theoretical model back in 1986, and the basics of this model have been confirmed over and over and over again since. There's all kinds of studies. The simple view is helpful because it disentangles some of the stuff that is most contentious in the debates about reading. So in what's known as the whole language view, and in the balanced literacy view more recently, the focus right from the start of reading instruction should be on getting kids to focus on the meaning of what they're reading. Whole language and balanced literacy are meaning emphasis approaches to reading instruction, as opposed to what's known as a code emphasis approach, which emphasizes decoding skills at the beginning of reading instruction. So early reading instruction that aligns with the science is a code emphasis approach so that kids can get to meaning. Everyone agrees that meaning is the goal. The question is, how does a little kid get there? So this is another model for understanding how skilled reading works. It's known as Scarborough's rope. Hollis Scarborough is a person, a psychologist at Haskins Labs, who's been studying reading development since the 1980s. Scarborough's rope helps unpack what goes into each side of the equation put forth in the simple view. So the upper strand has a lot of parts to it, and it is language comprehension. So this model shows that language comprehension is complex and intertwined. It's not just all the words you know the meaning of in oral language, it's also your level of knowledge. It's the stuff you know. And it's your understanding of how language works, language structure, grammar, your ability to make inferences, understand things like metaphors. This is a more nuanced explanation of what goes into the language comprehension part of the simple view equation. And it can help teachers understand, and parents, what might be going on when kids are decoding well, but they're struggling with reading comprehension. Very often, they have a language comprehension issue. Now, the lower strand of Scarborough's rope is the word recognition strand. So like the simple view of reading, Scarborough's rope shows that without good word recognition skills, you are not going to become a skilled reader. And the rope unpacks the various skills and abilities that go into word recognition. There's a lot to it. You can see that one element, just one, is decoding. This is basically your phonics knowledge. Do you have a good understanding of how the letters and combinations of letters represent the sounds in words? Now, if you teach students the basic letter sound combinations in the English language, it gives them access to successfully sounding out more than 80% of the words in English print. 80% is a lot, but it's not all. Children need more than just phonics knowledge to be successful with written English. That's why I think it's more useful to think about teaching children that phrase I used earlier, how their written language works. English spelling is not just based on the sounds and words. English is what's known as a morphophonemic language, and that means our spelling patterns are based on both sounds and meaning. So to understand English spelling, kids need some morphology. In other words, they need to understand the meaningful parts of words and how English words are put together, root words and prefixes and suffixes. And children could use some etymology too. That is, to understand English spelling, it really helps to know something about the history of our language. And the history of our language is fascinating. Now, English has a reputation for being this wacky language that's full of exceptions, but it's not. It is a melting pot language that has complex spelling patterns because English has roots in Greek and Latin and French and other languages. Now, written English is perhaps the most difficult alphabetic language to learn. It takes 2 to 3 years for a typically developing reader to master the basics of written English. In contrast, it takes only a few months for most kids in Italy to learn how to decode Italian because Italian spelling is almost perfectly regular. Italian is spelled the way it sounds. I think one of the reasons we've fought so much about reading instruction in the English-speaking world is that there's a lot to teaching children written English. So there's a lot to argue about in terms of how to teach it. So back to Scarborough's rope and the elements of the word recognition strand. So there's phonological awareness, that's understanding the sounds in words. There's decoding, understanding how letters represent those words. And there's also something called sight recognition. In my opinion, this is where things get really interesting. When you are a skilled reader, you do not actually have to decode most of the words you encounter. When you see a word that's familiar to you, you know the word immediately on sight. You don't have to sound it out. Scientists refer to the words that are instantly recognizable to you as sight words. Now, this term, sight words, can be super confusing because teachers and reading scientists usually mean different things when they use that term. In schools, sight words are typically words that kids are supposed to memorize. They may be words with unusual spellings that are difficult to decode, or they may be words that kids are going to come across a lot in their reading, in other words, high-frequency words. So children often come home with these words on flashcards, and they're supposed to memorize them. But what the science shows is that having kids memorize lots of words is not the best path to good word recognition skills. And it turns out that weak word recognition skills are the most common and the most debilitating source of reading problems. Struggling readers may also have language comprehension issues. But when children do not get off to a good start with decoding, it has an impact on the continued development of their language comprehension. And eventually, kids may be weak on the language comprehension side because they are weak on the word recognition side. This problem has been described as the Matthew effect, which is a biblical reference. Basically, when it comes to reading, the rich get richer. Here's how it works. If you come into school with lots of language comprehension, but you struggle with learning how to decode the words, your ability to continue to develop language comprehension may be impeded because one of the best ways to increase your knowledge and your vocabulary and your reasoning and your understanding of the structure of language is through reading. In contrast, if you come into school weak on the language comprehension side, but you are taught how to decode, you have just been given the gift that is your best bet for gaining knowledge and vocabulary because you can decode the words. This is why equity in education begins with good phonics instruction in the early grades. It is one of the most important things that teachers can do to try to even the playing field between kids who come from homes that give them an edge on the language comprehension side and kids who come from homes that may not be as rich and resourced when it comes to vocabulary development and access to knowledge. Good phonics instruction is where educational equity begins. It doesn't end there, but it's a foundation. Now, the good news is that most schools seem to be doing some kind of phonics instruction these days. Publishers and authors of curriculum materials know that if their stuff is going to have a chance of being considered research-based, there has to be some phonics. And if they didn't know that or believe it until recently, they are quickly adding a phonics component now. So that means we must be on the right path, that reading instruction is finally starting to line up with the science. Unfortunately, I don't think that's the case, because while more and more schools are adding a 20 or 30-minute phonics block, what I also see in schools are things like this. You may have seen these. These are word reading strategies that you will find in schools all over the country. I have seen these strategies everywhere. They're on posters in classrooms. They're on bookmarks that get sent home with kids. You can find them on Pinterest, on Teachers Pay Teachers. You can Google them and find a whole lot of pictures of these little characters. I've also seen things like this. So these are strategies for kids to use when they're reading and they come to a word they don't know. Now, these strategies seem sensible enough. You get to a word you don't know, what can you do? You can look at the picture to try to figure out what the word might be. You don't want to completely guess, so you can look at the first letter. You can look at how the word begins. This will narrow your choices. You can then check to see if you're right. You can reread the sentence using the word and see if the sentence makes sense. And if you're stuck, you can just skip the word and move on. Hopefully, you can get the gist of the sentence anyway. So what's the theory of how reading works that these strategies are based on? What's the idea? about how kids learn to read words. These strategies are rooted in a theory about reading that came to be known as 3Qing or multi-cueing. There's a bunch of different terms depending on where you are in the world. You can find these all over the English-speaking world. The idea is that readers use 3 different kinds of information or cues to identify words as they're reading. This idea was originally proposed by an education professor named Ken Goodman back in 1967 at the American Educational Research Association conference in New York City. Ken Goodman laid out the original theory in a paper that he called Reading, a Psycholinguistic Guessing Game. In the paper, Goodman rejected the idea that reading is a precise process that involves exact or detailed perception of letters or words. Instead, he argued that as people read, they make predictions about the words on the page using these 3 cues. So the graphic cues, what do the letters tell you about what the word might be? Syntactic cues, what kind of a word could it be? For example, a noun or a verb. Or semantic cues, what word would make sense here based on the context? In his paper, Goodman concluded this. He wrote, "Skill in reading involves not greater precision, but more accurate first guesses based on better sampling techniques, greater control over language structure, broadened experiences, and increased conceptual development. As the child develops reading skill and speed, he uses increasingly fewer graphic cues." Now, this was kind of a new twist on prevailing ideas about how reading works, and it went on to become a theoretical basis of the whole language approach to teaching reading. For the couple of centuries previous to the introduction of whole language, back in the 1970s, the debate about how reading works and how to teach it had focused on one of 2 big ideas. So one idea is that reading is a visual memory process. The teaching method associated with this word is the whole word method, also known as the look-say method. The basic idea is that if you see words enough and you associate those words with their meaning, you eventually store the words in your memory as visual images. This is the idea behind long lists of sight words that kids are supposed to memorize. The other idea is that reading requires knowledge of the relationships between sounds and letters, and that the way to identify a word is to sound it out. That's the phonics approach. Reading instruction was basically a series of pendulum swings between whole word and phonics until this new twist of an idea came along in the late 1960s that said, people don't read by sounding out words, and they don't read by memorizing words as wholes either. Instead, they use this cueing system. That is, they use context to predict what the words will be, and they use the letters to check their predictions. Now, many teachers have never heard of cueing, but they know this theory of word reading as MSV. M is for using meaning to figure out what a word is. S is for using sentence structure or syntax. And V is for using visual information, the letters in the word. You will find this MSV idea in lots of curriculum materials that define themselves as balanced literacy. You can trace the roots of this MSV idea back to the work of a woman named Marie Clay. Marie Clay was a developmental psychologist in New Zealand who came up with ideas about reading that were similar to Ken Goodman's at about the same time. They didn't develop these ideas together and they didn't agree on everything, but they did meet and travel in similar literacy circles back in the 80s and 90s. Clay built her ideas into a reading intervention program for struggling first graders called Reading Recovery. Reading Recovery was implemented across New Zealand in the 1980s, and it went on to become one of the most widely used reading intervention programs in the world. Clay's theories about reading were popularized as part of core reading instruction here in the United States by Irene Fountas and Gay-Sue Pinnell. They are education professors who learned from Clay back in the 1980s. Fountas and Pinnell are well known for an approach to reading instruction known as guided reading, and for a widely used reading assessment system that uses what are known as leveled books. Fountas and Pinnell also sell a reading intervention program called Leveled Literacy Intervention, or LLI. You will also find the cueing theory of reading in the Units of Study materials written by Lucy Calkins at Teachers College Columbia. Units of Study is more commonly known as Readers and Writers Workshop. You will find some phonics in the Calkins and Fountas and Pinnell approaches. In fact, Lucy Calkins recently created a Units of Study for Teaching Phonics program. Fountas and Pinnell have books and materials to teach phonics too, and they have for a long time. But phonics is presented as one way to know what a word is. It's one strategy. It's that third cue in the 3 cueing system. What schools need to know is that when they buy materials from Calkins and Fountas and Pinnell, they are buying an approach to teaching reading that is rooted in a particular theory about how reading works. And it's the idea that skilled readers use meaning and context to identify words as they read. What you are likely to find in a lot of American classrooms today is 20 to 30 minutes of a phonics program, and then readers workshop and guided reading, where kids are taught that when they come to a word they don't know, they can sound it out and use what they've learned in their phonics lessons. But they can also use the cueing strategies. They can think about a word that makes sense. They can look at the first letter of the word, or they can just take a page from Skippy the Frog and they can skip the word altogether. So what's wrong with this? I mean, why not teach kids lots of strategies to help them when they come to a word they don't know? Why not teach cueing? Well, it comes back to the scientific research. So what is going on in these little boys' brains as they're learning to read? For a long time, no one knew. And that's one of the reasons we fought so much about how to teach reading. But as I've said, over the past half century or so, scientists in labs and classrooms all over the world have done a mountain of studies about how skilled reading works. And here's a key thing they figured out. Skilled readers do not use cues and context to read words. In fact, what scientists have discovered is that this is how poor readers read. Poor readers often have a hard time with word identification. Too many of the words they come across are little mysteries, series of letters they don't know and can't quite figure out. So they use a bunch of other strategies to try to understand what the words say. They memorize as many words as they can. When they come across a word they don't know, they look at the first few letters and try to think of a word that makes sense. In other words, they use context to try to come up with a word that fits. And when they can't figure out what a word is using context clues, they skip the word. Often they can get a gist of what they're reading this way. But using context, guessing, and skipping words, this is not what reading is like when you are a skilled reader. What cognitive scientists have figured out is that a key difference between skilled readers and unskilled readers is that skilled readers can immediately and accurately recognize words. They don't need to guess or predict or use context. Skilled readers know tens of thousands of words instantly on sight. In fact, if you're a skilled reader, your brain has gotten so good at reading words that you process the word book faster than you process a picture of a book. So how did your brain get so good at that? You were not born with a brain that was meant to do that. It happens through a process called orthographic mapping. Sounds weedy and complicated, and it is. But knowing some basics about orthographic mapping is key, I think, to understanding why phonics instruction is important. And it's important for understanding why teaching cueing is not a good idea. So here's a quick and simplified explanation of orthographic mapping. Orthographic mapping is the process that we use to store printed words in our long-term memory. The way you do that is by attending closely to how a written word is spelled and then linking that sequence of letters to the word's pronunciation and its meaning. So for a very simple example, a child knows the meaning and pronunciation of the word cat. The word gets orthographically mapped to her memory when she links the sounds k, at to the written word C-A-T. So this requires an awareness of the speech sounds in words. That's phonemic awareness. It also requires an understanding of how those sounds are represented by letters. That's phonics. So you need phonemic awareness and you need phonics to orthographically map words into your long-term memory. Once a word has been orthographically mapped to your memory, you know it instantly on sight. In fact, you cannot suppress your ability to read that word. You don't have to sound out the word when you see it. You know it instantly because at some point you successfully sounded it out and you linked the spelling of the word in your mind with the meaning and the pronunciation of that word. Now, by about second grade, a typically developing reader who has good phonics skills needs just a few exposures to a word through its pronunciation, its spelling, and its meaning, and bam, the word is mapped to her memory. The more words that a reader maps to her memory this way, the more she can focus on the meaning of what she's reading. She's not using her brain power to identify the words. She's using her brain power to understand what she's reading. And this is the goal, for readers to comprehend what they're reading. For some reason, debates about reading have ended up stuck in an argument about whether teachers should focus on helping kids learn to decode words or whether they should focus on reading comprehension. But that debate makes no sense at all. How can you fully comprehend what you're reading if you cannot accurately read the words? You can't. There are studies that prove this. Let me give you another orthographic mapping example. So when my son was in about 10th grade, he was reading something out loud to me and he said, epitome. I stopped him and asked, epitome, do you mean epitome? Oh, he said, you could practically see the light bulbs going off in his head, epitome. So my son had obviously heard that word before. Maybe he had a basic gist of it kind of idea of what the word means. He may have come across the word in print before too, paused, sounded it out, epitome, I don't know that word. But now, reading out loud to me, he had the aha moment that he needed to realize that's a word I've heard before. So we briefly discussed the meaning of the word. Here it is. So epitome, a person or a thing that is a perfect example of a particular type or quality. So the next time my son sees that word in print, he's going to know what it is. And the science suggests that with another few exposures, that word will be permanently stored in his memory. He'll see it and know it. The spelling, the pronunciation, and the meaning of that word will all be there for him in an instant. What scientists have discovered is that skilled word reading is like a reflex. It's not a detective game. It's not contextual guessing. It is not a series of strategic actions. It is automatic and it's effortless. However, as you can see in the example of my son, there's so much more than decoding skill at play. Readers must have a good oral vocabulary. My son had heard the word epitome. The light bulbs wouldn't have gone off for him if he hadn't. Your ability to comprehend what you read is tightly linked to your vocabulary and your knowledge. This is one reason that reading scores tend to be associated with family income and educational background. Knowing the meaning of lots of words gives you an advantage. It gives you an edge when it comes to orthographic mapping and when it comes to understanding what you read. And having a mother who hears you read epitome and clues you into the fact that the word is epitome, well, that helps a whole lot too. Family background matters. It can tilt the scales in your favor, especially on the language comprehension side of things. But having a big oral vocabulary and lots of knowledge is not enough. By some estimates, a third of struggling readers are from college-educated families. Children need to be taught how to read the words on the page. They need to be taught how their written language works. And when teachers use the cueing system I told you about, when they teach all those word reading strategies, they're actually impeding the orthographic mapping process. I'm going to explain with a story. So these are first graders in Oakland, California. And a literacy coach who worked with these girls came to see that teaching the cueing system, or MSV, the meaning, structure, visual idea, it was actually making it harder for her students to learn how to read. The coach's name is Margaret Goldberg. She was hired by the Oakland Unified School District back in 2015 to teach leveled literacy intervention. LLI is the reading intervention program that I mentioned that was developed by Irene Fountas and Gay-Sue Pinnell. They're also known as Fountas and Pinnell, or just F&P. LLI does include some phonics instruction. It also teaches kids that when they come to a word they don't know, they have lots of strategies for figuring out the word. They can sound it out, but they can also use pictures and context and other cues to try to come up with a good guess. So Margaret Goldberg started teaching LLI. It was what she was hired to do. Around the same time, she found a box of unopened materials sitting on a shelf in her school collecting dust, and it was a systematic phonics and phonemic awareness program that teaches kids when they come to a word they don't know, they sound it out, and it doesn't teach any cueing. And in this phonics and phonemic awareness program, beginning readers practice reading in decodable books that contain words with spelling patterns they have been taught. So they don't have to guess at words. Margaret started teaching some of her groups LLI with cueing, and some of her groups she taught systematic phonics and phonemic awareness with no cueing. And she started to notice differences between the two groups of children, not just in how well they were reading, but in the way they approached their reading. She and a colleague recorded first graders talking about what makes them good readers. So this is a video. I'm going to play it for you. Mia is in the white shirt. She was learning phonics and no cueing, and Jabria is in the pink jacket, and she was taught the cueing system. Let's make sure my volume is up. Here we go.
Guess what makes you good readers? I learn a lot. Because I look at the pictures and I read it.
Ooh. Do you remember when you were little and you didn't know how to read?
Yes.
Like when you started
Kind of.
kindergarten?
Yeah.
What helped you learn how to read? How did you learn?
By looking at the pictures.
Anything else?
Looking at the words and sounding them out.
Margaret Goldberg was seeing this over and over in her two groups of students. So one group was taking away from their reading instruction that reading is about looking closely at words and sounding them out. And another group of children was learning that when you come to a word you don't know, you don't have to look at it carefully and try to connect the spelling with the pronunciation and the meaning. Instead, you can look away from the word. You can look at the picture, you can look at the other words in the sentence. Basically, you search around for clues to help you identify the word. Now remember, orthographic mapping requires you to look carefully at words so your brain links the spelling with the sounds and the meaning. But cueing teaches kids to look away from the words. Here's what Margaret Goldberg said to me about the kids in her LLI groups. She said, I did lasting damage to these kids. It was so hard to ever get them to stop looking at a picture to guess what a word would be. It was so hard to ever get them to slow down and sound a word out because they had had this experience of knowing that you predict what you read before you read it. As Margaret was noticing the differences between her two groups of students, she was discovering the scientific research on reading. It was not stuff she knew or had been taught. She was shocked by what she was learning and how different it was from what the curriculum materials were telling her about how reading works. But what Margaret was learning from the curriculum materials about how reading works is what lots of teachers are learning about how reading works. Instructional approaches that include cueing are all over American classrooms. So this is the podcast episode and article from 2019, where I explain the problems with the cueing and strategies approach to teaching reading. As I said earlier, most schools appear to do some kind of phonics instruction these days, but just because a school has added phonics does not mean that reading instruction aligns with scientific research on reading. If children are being taught the cueing system, they are being taught to read the way that poor readers read. I'll say that again. If children are being taught the cueing system, they are being taught the strategies of struggling readers. This, I think, is a big elephant in the room when it comes to reading instruction in the United States today. Schools and publishers are adding what I've come to think of as a phonics patch. They're checking the phonics box, but they're still teaching cueing. Why is that? Well, I think there are many reasons, but I think a big one is that schools are better at adding things than they are at taking things away. And many educators believe in cueing because if they were taught anything about how reading works, they were likely taught the idea that readers use meaning, structure, and visual cues to identify words as they're reading. And cueing seems to work for some kids because some kids, maybe even most kids in some schools, will learn to read no matter how they're taught. They will learn to read in spite of the instruction, but many kids won't. So What the Words Say is the most recent podcast episode and article where I try to explain the consequences of all this. This podcast starts with a visit to a juvenile detention center where you will find an awful lot of struggling readers. The big problem that we are facing in this country is that reading instruction is based on an assumption about reading that turns out not to be true. The assumption is that as long as kids are in an environment that supports and encourages lots of reading, they will become good readers. When kids struggle to learn how to read under these conditions, there are typically two responses. One, there must be a problem in the home. The child wasn't read to enough. Or two, there must be a problem in the child. He or she has a disability. But usually it's neither. Most of the time when kids can't read, it's because they weren't taught how to do it. So what are the consequences of all of this? Well, look here. These are scores on the most recent National Assessment of Educational Progress, otherwise known as the NAEP. The NAEP shows that more than 50% of Black fourth graders read below basic. Half of American Indian kids and nearly half of Hispanic children are below basic too. And white kids aren't doing so great either. 54% of them are at basic or below. Right now in this country, reading instruction is tilted in favor of the few who do not need much instruction to become good readers, and the few who can get what they need in spite of the instruction because they have parents who can pay for what they need. Fixing the problem begins with recognizing that it does not have to be this way. Teachers deserve to be taught how skilled reading develops. They deserve to be taught what they need to know to teach kids how to read in a direct and explicit way. And kids, all kids, deserve this kind of instruction. I'm going to leave you with my contact information and a website where we have collected all of our podcast episodes and articles about reading. And I want to end on a note of hope in this very, very long and very difficult year. Coronavirus has caused so much pain and suffering, an incalculable amount of grief. And among the wreckage are many young children who have missed out on desperately needed time in school, as Comer was talking about, and as we all know. But the pandemic has provided many parents with a front row seat on how their children are being taught. Instruction was a bit of a black box before. What is my kid learning in school? Well, a lot of parents and caregivers across this country are now watching on Zoom. They are seeing how their children are being taught to read. And from what I am observing on social media and what I am getting in my inbox, a lot of them are alarmed. They are seeing the word reading strategies. They are watching their kids skip and guess words, and they're thinking, what is this? I don't think this makes sense. An increasing number of teachers and other educators are asking, why are we teaching reading this way? I think there is an opportunity right now to fix this, to actually align instruction with what 50 years of scientific research has shown us about how children learn to read and what they need to be taught. So thank you very much for listening to me for all this time. I look forward to your questions, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and look forward to what you have to say. Thank you very much.
Wow, Emily, thank you so much for such a powerful talk. We're getting ready to move to Q&A. My name is Ryan Lee James. I am the director of the Rollins Center for Language and Literacy at the Atlanta Speech School. And Emily, on behalf of our entire community, thank you for sharing all that you've learned in the course of your career about the science of reading and how our children are being educated. Excuse me. So we're going to just kick this off with some Q&A. We've gotten some great questions from YouTube, some great questions from our viewers on Facebook. And our first question, Emily, for you tonight is, I'm sorry, let me make sure I get this one right. Can you speak to how the field and research of the science of reading is changing or growing since you started your investigative reporting?
You know, I think there's a lot going on right now. As I said, I think coronavirus is giving a little bit of a kick. But I would say for several years, there are a number of things that have really been bringing a lot of things together. So before I even started my reporting, and in part why I started doing my reporting, is there's a growing parent movement that is really, and many of that is motivated by the parents of kids with dyslexia, kids who are really having a severe trouble reading in school. I like to think of kids with dyslexia as sort of canaries in the coal mine. Like when kids with dyslexia can't read, it's like a sign that something's wrong. But I think for too long, it's been a little bit treated like, oh, well, there are kids with dyslexia and they need something and everyone else is fine with this other thing. And what the science really shows us, this is a big continuum. You know, some people are very severely dyslexic, but it's this whole continuum. Some people learn to read super easily, some people don't, and most of us are somewhere in between. And the problem is, if we are not teaching kids how to read, we have many more kids falling on that side of having dyslexia, being a struggling reader, when if they were taught how to read well right from the beginning, that might not have happened to them. They might have needed a little bit of extra help. They might not need the kind of intense remediation that they often need by the time they get to third and fourth and fifth grade, and it's harder to help them at that point. So I think a few things have happened. The research base is so robust. I cannot express to you how big it is, how much research there is. There are so many books, scientific articles, blog, there's so much stuff out there that you can, it's incredible how much research there is. So that's the first thing. The research base is this strong and thorough, and sure, there are things that researchers are still trying to figure out about reading, but there's a consensus that they've come to They agree on certain basic things about what reading is and how it works and why kids struggle. Okay. Then add to that parents kind of getting savvy to this, parents of struggling readers realizing like, this isn't just about dyslexia. This isn't just about my kid. This is affecting all the kids. It's affecting lots of the kids. And then I think me and other reporters have started to bring some of this stuff to greater attention. Policymakers and others are saying, I think for a long time in the kind of reading wars and the debates about reading, I've been sort of led to believe that the whole thing's about phonics, and it was sort of a fight about phonics for a long time. And what's happened is a lot of people who have been able to sort of say, we're a lot of schools, publishers, whatever, be like, as long as they add some phonics, they're all good. And what we miss in that is no, there's some theoretical fights we had about reading and how it works. And the side that turned out to be not so right, that stayed in place while people added some phonics. So the theoretical basics of whole language, which is really fundamentally sort of built on this idea that learning to read is like learning to talk, and that the reading process is driven by language comprehension. As you know from my talk, language comprehension is an assist. It's an important part of it, but it's not what drives the process. Good language comprehension skills is not necessarily going to get you there. Right. So I just think a lot of things have been coming together. So I think just over the past few years, I think a lot's happening. There's a number of states that are really taking a big look at it. There's a number of, and there are different levers that need to be pushed to get things changed. But I think there's a lot going on. So that's why I think it's really an important moment. I think this is a moment to see.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that response. And something that you said that resonated with me about how this movement sort of started with parents of children who have dyslexia is a really interesting point to make, and tied to what you were talking about surrounding equity, because we know that in our country, our Black and Brown children, our children from lower SES backgrounds, actually under our federal law IDEA have a harder time getting a diagnosis of dyslexia. And so what that leads to, of course, is underrepresentation of those students in special education, speech language, and learning disabilities categories. And so if they're not getting that explicit instruction, if that explicit instruction is sort of reserved for intervention, then our kids, our most vulnerable kids in some cases, they're not getting it in tier 1 or in general instruction, and then also not qualifying for special education. So Absolutely. It's really quite a conundrum for us in this country.
It absolutely is. And the thing is, many parents will fight and fight and fight to get special education, and sometimes that's the answer. I mean, you're right. In too many schools, explicit instruction is reserved only to get access to it. You have to get special ed. But just getting special ed doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get good instruction. I'm shocked at the number of special ed teachers who didn't learn about the science, who don't actually know a lot of this stuff either. And schools don't necessarily have good programs in place to help kids. And so it really is a mess. And, how do you find, when you go into high poverty schools, because of all the things that I just told you about how reading works, right? You can see how family income and background can have a huge impact on the process of learning to read, right? And we're in this country where we have all these high poverty schools. We put all kinds of kids from low income backgrounds and kids of color in the same school. So lots of those kids are struggling to read. They're not getting the instruction they need. And you can't even find the kids who have the reading disabilities when 80% of them, 90% of them can't read on grade level anyway. Right. It's like an emergency situation in the school. None of the kids are reading. How do you find the kids with dyslexia when none of the kids can read?
That's right.
You don't. And then they get really lost, and then it's an absolute disaster for those children.
An absolute disaster. That's Emily, you're dropping some knowledge. Let me ask you a related question. So basically what you just shared, and then in your talk, and then in your point just now, why is it so hard? I mean, the evidence is, it's been around for years, but it's emerging now. There's much more opportunity, and the science of reading is being disseminated beyond scholarly and peer-reviewed journals. So why is this, from your perspective, why is this information so hard to accept? Like, why with the decades of research And at some point, right, that was sort of reserved for peer-reviewed journals and scholarly articles, and then practitioners didn't have access. But that's not really the case anymore. So what do you think is holding school districts, school leaders, state, local governments back from enforcing or making sure that the science of reading is in every classroom?
So you ask a question, it's a complex question that has many answers to it. So I'll just try to bite off a little bit. I mean, I'd say it's 2 big points. I mean, number one, this research has been around for a long time, but it takes a long time for research in any field to get into practice. Okay. People can look at the field of medicine. There was some crazy stuff based on beliefs and no evidence that we did in medicine for a long time. And it actually took the medical field quite a bit of work. There was quite a bit of frustration, quite a bit of intransigence, and people were dying. People are dying because of reading instruction too. People were dying, and people believed in the way they were doing it. It was hard for them to change. So it takes a long time for research to make its way into practice. So this research is relatively new in terms of the course of human history about how knowledge changes the way we do things. So that's one thing. I think it's also, as some people have pointed out, a lot is known about the science of reading. Scientists know a lot about how children learn to read. It's not as clear exactly how to teach it. There's more weeds, there's more debates, there's more things that need to be figured out about how to translate the research into practice. It's not perfect. There's a whole literature on translational science in all kinds of fields too, and that's tricky. But then I will also say that I think that there's a lot of intransigence because there's vested interests in the status quo. There are people who don't want things to change. They have professional reputations. They believe deeply and honestly in some of these ideas. Like, they don't have any ill will towards children. They think this stuff is working because it seems to be working for a lot of the kids that they're teaching, or they have a blind spot because they really believe in it. But they've published, they've written books, they've given professional development, they've become literacy gurus based on some of this stuff. And it's hard to admit you are wrong and to change. And there's money here too. There's a lot of people making a lot of money. And that's a big element here in America. We are a capitalism on steroids and a market-driven economy. And when you've been making money off of selling a certain number of things, it's not so easy to redo it. Although you can keep selling new products, and that's what people do. They're like, well, we'll sell you something else.
Yeah, that's a really good point, especially about medicine. I mean, in every field, it does take a while for that basic research to translate into practice. But, Comer mentioned in his opening about COVID and a vaccine. I mean, this is such a critical issue facing our country. And we know what happens if you don't learn to read in this country. Your opportunities are limited. Your overall health, your life is negatively impacted. So I've got a follow-up question to that, Emily. So someone from Facebook asks, do you have any recommendations for how families can advocate in our communities for a change in the way that we're teaching reading?
Well, I think the number one thing that I've learned from talking to hundreds and hundreds of parents now over the years is to recognize that you're not alone. Like, a lot of parents feel like they're alone. They're the only one with a kid with a struggling reader, but there are other struggling readers in your kid's classroom. There are other, so find the other parents who are concerned about this. And then I think there's a kind of a sense that there was nothing they could do about it. But I think a lot of the parent advocacy and some of the changes that are happening shows there is stuff that can be done about it. Parents actually have a decent amount of power. Parents have a very difficult time. Like, the power of sort of edu-speak and the education establishment can really shut them down. But when parents act together, they really can have a decent amount of power. And when they come armed with real knowledge, I guess what I would say is, for the parents who are concerned about this, do your homework, find out this stuff, understand the nuances of the stuff so that the educrats can't, talk around you and tell you, we've got it, don't worry. We've got LLI, we've got phonics, we've got blah, blah, we're all set. Like, know how to push back and ask questions and be like, I don't think so. So that's what I would say. And I think it's just more power in numbers. And there's a number of parents who have really had some success by doing things like filing group complaints with the state level, putting pressure. Everything's political. Put pressure on your schools, put pressure on your school boards. put pressure on the superintendent.
Absolutely. Yeah.
This stuff can change. And there's a move, there's enough activity going on that any parent who's thinking about this can find other places where there are people concerned, can point to other places, school systems that have made changes, people that are doing things. So collect all that stuff and point it out to the people who need to know in your community.
So sort of along related lines, why do you feel like in our society, more often we're blaming families for their child's lack of achievement instead of instead of holding our local officials accountable, instead of holding, our school systems accountable?
Well, it's an insidious thing. And again, I think there's a lot of answers to that. With reading in particular, though, I think one of the reasons that families get blamed is because of this core belief that reading is natural and that as long as kids are read to enough and have access to books, that they'll be fine. I live in the Washington, D.C. area, and someone told me an anecdote about a librarian around here. I didn't talk to the librarian, so this is third hand. But anyway, here's the anecdote. She's in a pretty wealthy Washington, D.C. neighborhood where there are some fancy private schools that people pay like $40,000 a year to send their kids to. And she says, people come in all the time. Parents come in and say, do you have a book where I could just teach for something way I could teach my kids to read? Is there a book for that? Because there are like not an insubstantial number of kids who are being sent to fancy private schools, and they want a certain kind of school for their kids. And they sort of like what this person said is that these parents seem to think it's their job to teach the kids to read. It's somehow not the school's job, it's theirs. This belief is so deep in our culture that if kids can't read, it's the parents' fault, that even the parents themselves think it's their fault. And like, I need to teach the kids to read. Whoa, where did that come from? What's the purpose of school? Why shouldn't we send our kids to school and expect the schools will teach the kids how to read? And it's, I think it gets down to some bigger questions that cut across education about what we think we want school to be like. And these are value-laden questions, but there's a huge, huge, huge amount of research about the importance of direct and explicit instruction. And so many of our schools are not set up that way fundamentally. People are in love with discovery learning and project-based learning. And I'm not saying those things aren't good, but those things especially, we have lost what it takes for young children, novices, people who don't know how to do things, what it takes for them to learn how to do those things. We can do so much sort of discovery learning with kids when they know the basics, but at the early grades, when it comes to reading and other things, we've got to teach kids how to do it. I actually just heard, I was listening to a podcast on a walk earlier today, and I heard someone call this problem a butterfly who forgot she was a caterpillar. And the idea is once you're an expert at something, you forget about what it takes to become an expert at that. And so many of us can read and can read pretty well, and a lot of us can't. This is a secret. There's lots and lots and lots of struggling adult readers out there. But because so many people have sort of figured out how to read well, you forget what it takes for a 5-year-old to learn how to do it. And with the English language in particular, this is difficult. It is hard for most kids to learn how to read. And whether kids struggle with reading or not doesn't have anything to do with their intelligence or how smart they are. Some really smart kids really can't read without a lot of help. So anyway, I just think these beliefs run really, really deep. So we just gotta get these beliefs out on the table and tell people that this is not so. Learning to read is not like learning to talk. It is not going to happen naturally. Some kids, you can read books to them till the end of time, and they are not going to learn how to read.
That's right. And it's so, I think that what you're saying about families is so spot on. And in some of, just thinking about some of our communities where the adult literacy rates are extremely high, and in situations where families, where, your child may go to the same elementary school that you went to, that didn't, in the same school district that didn't teach you to read. And now you've got a child in that district. And so often we're saying to families, read to your child, read to your child, read to your child, really putting that onus, on families. And then, like you said, they accept it. They feel like this is my child, my responsibility. And it just becomes this horrendous cycle. I have a couple. Well, let me see if I can get one more question, Emily, because I know we've got a few more minutes before we end. So we had a question from Facebook about, just throughout your investigative reporting, have you, or what is your experience and understanding of what's taking place in the birth through pre-K space or the early learning space, that is either setting children up for success for kindergarten or not? And what do you see as the role that communities can play in supporting that early learning development?
Well, as you can see from all we know about how reading development occurs, all that language comprehension stuff is super important. So all of the effort that's put on to talking to children and reading to children is really important. And that should continue to be done. I think sometimes that work contributes to the myth, though, that if you do that, you're good. As long as kids get all of that early language and they're set up to, like, they're ready for school, then everything should be fine. But we forget about they're ready for school. Now, what's school going to do to take this ready child and help them become a reader? That's what's sort of gotten missed. So these efforts to give books to kids and to go into hospitals where mothers have given birth are great, but they can contribute to the myth that is in our way. So I think we have to deal with that one. And I had one other thought about what you said and it went right out of my brain, but maybe I'll think about it in a second. Anyway, oh, I know. The other thing is that it's really, really important to understand, and you like identifying when kids are having difficulty with language when they're young, when they're having speech and language issues, because that can really, that's an early warning sign right there. A kid who's having a trouble with articulation, who's having, you can't really understand what they're saying, other kinds of speech and language problems, that can really translate into a reading problem. And that's another place where we have huge, horrible disparities when it comes to family income and race, right? So we have lots of kids of color who are having speech and language issues and they're not getting identified and they're not getting the help they need. And that's a huge problem.
And Emily, I think the most recent data shows that is a problem in early intervention in part C of IDEA that serves birth to 3, and continues to be a challenge in part B of IDEA that serves our elementary school through secondary children. Wow. That's, I mean, again, you're dropping some nuggets. I hope the audience, I hope you guys are enjoying this conversation with Emily.
Can I say one other thing? Maybe
yes,
too much of a bomb
please.
Too. I mean, it, especially in a year when this country is having incredibly important reckonings about race and racism in this country, I just think that we have accepted for too long that a lot of kids aren't going to read very well because they're poor or kids of color or something. Like that has been used as an excuse. And if this many white children were failing to learn to read, this wouldn't be the same problem.
Don't say it.
However, as I showed you in that data, don't forget that white children aren't doing so good either. This is why everyone needs to care. White children are not okay either. So many of the kids are not okay. And we've come to accept somehow that this is just kind of the way things are. And I think it's so sad because you said before, when parents come to schools and say something's going on, my daughter can't read, my son can't read, and the teachers are just told, well, read to him more. More and more teachers across the country are realizing, like, oh my God, that's the only answer I have. Why don't I have more answers? Why don't I know more about what to do? And it's devastating for those teachers. And then when they start to realize how much is known about this, the guilt and the shame and the anxiety and the overwhelming, it's just not fair to teachers. This is so not fair to kids. It's really not fair to teachers either. We've got to change it. Teachers deserve to know this so they can help little kids. Teachers want to help little kids. There's no teacher out there who doesn't want her students to learn how to read. There just isn't.
No one goes into the profession thinking, I don't want my kids to succeed. I mean, not at all. I'm so glad you stopped to make that point, because the earlier question from one of our Facebook viewers who asked, what can communities do? What can families do? I think we're taking a huge step tonight. We're really grateful for the Montag family for making this lecture possible for the last 23 years, because this is a huge step in helping people understand what this crisis is. Because as you noted, there are people who don't know. There are families who don't know, who are sending their children to school every day with the expectation that they're learning. And so this is a huge problem. It's not, it's not an SES problem only. It's not a Black children can't achieve problem. It is a problem that's plaguing our nation. But I'm so glad you made the point about if this were, as many white children failing, it would be a different sort of outrage. And so we all have to get outraged because the kids are our future, right? This is who we're looking to, all kids, to remain, to be the best that we can be. So I'm really appreciative of you saying that, Emily. And I just want to thank you on behalf of the Rollins Center, the Speech School, Cox Campus. Thank you for sharing tonight. This has been outstanding. I want to say to everyone who's watching on Facebook and YouTube, we have several questions. And I feel like because we didn't get to them, what we should do over the next couple of days is take some of these questions and respond to them on our Facebook page, because they're such great questions. And we want to be sure that we're able to respond to you guys. So I'm just going to share a few closing remarks. Again, Emily, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks to each of you for joining us tonight. I hope you've been transformed by Emily's presentation to meet, reach, and teach all children in this moment. Join us on the Cox Campus to figure out how. Our mission at the Rollins Center for Language and Literacy through our free online Cox Campus is to eradicate illiteracy by providing access to the science. Research tells us that every adult in a child's life plays a critical role and has a responsibility in laying the foundation for literacy. So whether you're the caregiver of an infant or toddler, talking, reading, singing, and playing with your child to build vocabulary, sound awareness, listening comprehension, or whether you are a second grade teacher, responsible for planning and executing a multi-sensory explicit reading lesson, your role and responsibility is critical. As Emily noted tonight, unlike communication, none of us are born with the innate ability to read. Within the walls of the speech school, for each child and for every child through our online Cox Campus, we turn to the science to dig deeper and truly understand the actions and steps adults can take to build every child's deep reading brain. We recognize that this work is especially important now as our society is facing twin pandemics, systemic injustice and inequality, and COVID-19. At Cox Campus, we've used the last couple of months to refine our tools and expand our practices to meet you in this critical moment. One way we're doing this is through expansion of our kindergarten through third grade literacy coursework in partnership with Dr. Deb Glazer, whose science-informed literacy instruction is world-renowned. This new coursework is designed to help you with a transformative school year, one that puts literacy and equity at its core for every child and every teacher. As always, access to these courses is free and unlimited on www.coxcampus.org. Together, we can change who we are with and for our children to ensure that every child is on a path to deciding their own future. We've talked a lot about literacy tonight in the science of reading, but the reality is literacy is not the destination. Instead, it's a pathway, the gateway to self-determination. If you're an instructional leader, coach, or educator, and you'd like to learn ways that you can implement our kindergarten through third grade coursework in your summer professional development and throughout your academic year, please reach out to us at info@coxcampus.org. Again, thank you for spending time with us this evening, and a huge thank you to Emily for this inspiring, empowering discussion. Have a great night.